Ok, ya inicia a grabar, ya está activada la interpretación, ya les voy a poner unos avisos en el chat.
Bueno,
Para que
perfecto.
bueno,
Entonces, damos la bienvenida a todos los participantes en el día de hoy a este evento, que es continuación de un evento que tuvimos la semana pasada. Yo voy a estar en el día de hoy moderando este evento que está
We welcome
enfocado
everybody to this meeting. We're going to be working on this event that is based on the other conservation measures based in areas. I am Clara Matallana. I am part of the Union for Perspectives. I am the focal point for the special group of OMEC of Latin America and the Caribbean. We hope that we have a dialogue that is very productive today. And in this event that we have named, We Have to Talk. It is important for us to talk about some topics as the goal three of the community world framework. Maybe everybody was not here last week, but we talked about some of the elements of that goal. And today we're going to have an agenda that is a little more focused on the OMEC. We're going to have some presentations of context, some reflections of the specialist group of OMEC from the World Commission of Protected Areas, and some of the processes of the countries that have been working on this topic of OMEC. We have representatives from countries such as Mexico, Colombia, Chile, Ecuador, Costa Rica, and Brazil. We're going to have also a presentation regarding the report of OMEC to the World Database on behalf of Janet Lesma of the US DMC. And we're going to have some time for questions by the audience. In this event, we also want to remind and honor the memory and the legacy of Kathy Machinen, who was for many years the chair of the World Commission on Protected Areas and focal point of OMEC, the director of this group. And she participated in many events in this region. She left a great legacy in terms of preservation. And unfortunately, she left us a couple of weeks ago, and she will be very remembered. And we will try to continue on with her legacy in these matters related to conservation. For our first participation, we're going to have a context, a current context regarding the OMEC and regarding these other measures of preservation or conservation based on areas. And I want to remind you that this is an event that is part of the context of a project in which the World Commission on Protected Areas is working on. So we have with us Paula Bueno, who is going to tell us a little bit about this context and who has performed in the last few years as the representative of the World Commission on Protected Areas for Latin America. So we are going to have the participation of Paula, and she's going to tell us a little bit about this context of the OMEC. Paula, the floor is yours so that you can make your presentation. Thank you very much, Clara. And to all the participants, we hope that we have more people joining every day. We're going to be sending out reminders of the translation. And please, thank you for also working on the chat, talking on chat. It's a very good dynamic. If you allow me, Augusta or Clara, so that I might be able to share if somebody has the host. And meanwhile, I will present myself very quickly. I am Paula Bueno. I am the Vice President, Regional Vice President of the World Commission for Protected Areas of the UICN for the Southern region. And in this wonderful group that we have consolidated and that we have demonstrated a few minutes ago with a slide with different names and many other people that accompany us from different developments. I currently work as the Senior Manager of Oceanic Governance and International Conservation in the Division of the Americas, and I'm here to accompany you in this site that once again is represented the majority, in the greatest possibility, a great number of developments, of concerns, of visions, especially of concerns that to be continue on, being able to continue on and a step ahead, what the countries need to be able to make this knowledge, to be able to learn. regarding this. Now I hear a noise. Please, I want to remind you to put your microphones in silence. Thank you very much. Mute your microphones. I still cannot share. Now I'm going to be able to do it. Okay, wonderful. And simply to tell you and go a little deeper into what Clara has already mentioned a few minutes ago, and it is that effectively all this came about, all this need came about from the fact that we had to sit down and talk. It is included within. Thank you for silencing the microphone. It is included within this trend or this that we're doing worldwide now calling conservation based on areas. Why? Because we are acknowledging different measures, effective measures, and I want to make emphasis on the fact that it is about having effective areas for the conservation in sight. And of course, it seems that we have a series of initiatives that promote that conservation in situ, and we're going to go a little deeper into that. And I would like to remind also that to be able to adopt the one that it is today, the third goal of the World Framework on Biodiversity, we have done a series of revisions of evidence that to be able to establish the objectives, the goals, and the sites. This revision of evidence is a work that apart also takes the many of the legacies that was left to us from the implementation of the 11th goal of ICE. In other words, from the previous planification for the biodiversity in the 10-year framework, the biological corridor. And what this invites us is to review a series of literature, but also of evidence in terms of having sensitivity to have testimonials that are specific on the field and on behalf of different instances. So we have some studies that are scientific. We have some studies that deal with considering in the same way other systems of knowledge, like is the case of the platform, the governmental platform of eco services and biodiversity, and of course the job that is done by the colleagues or by the experts of the commission that effectively, well, they are not anything else but people that on our day to day and in our daily work, we carry out conservation in one way or another. So, what is it that is happening also? And what is it that we're trying to have into account in this type of studies? And it is to review a series of articles in the planning, the systematic planning of the conservation, to think about in this moment these characteristics of these crises and this risk that we are facing nowadays with respect to the loss of biodiversity, for example, and the increase of the temperature, global temperature, and everything that this brings along in terms of those ecological values. To establish and to lead us to think how much is required, what is that minimum of the preservation that is necessary to be able to safeguard our ecosystems. Of course, a minimum doesn't mean that that minimum is the only thing that we have to achieve, but there is a need also to take that luggage to be able to make that type of decision, like the one that was carried out through the framework of biodiversity, which is what does is give us a vision to be able to plan to the future and to be able to maintain some minimums that will also lead us to be able to comply with adequate conservation of the territories. So this review, we're not going to go into details, but what it does is basically to tell us, look, our objective, everything has to be considered in an integral manner. It cannot be, uh, we need different strategies for the protection and the for preservation that is formally acknowledged, but for the areas. We have to we have to take into a series of considerations in view of the territories, so that that quality of that preservation might be effective and it might be good in the long term. These are topics that we have to take into account. And this preservation of the protected areas is going to be fundamental in different aspects, like the ones that we see here on the screen, and that are a tool. for the standard of the green list. Uh, and that based on that is that we can effectively make a measurement of the effective results of the preservation or conservation, and at the end of how we're having containing the loss of biodiversity, which is another one of the final goals that this is leading us to what for and what is the minimum for that conservation.
Perdón por
Paula,
interrumpirnos, están
sorry
diciendo
for
que
interrupting, but they're
Rafael
telling
se
us
deja de modo presentador.
that
No sé si es
the
posible,
screen is not being seen is
ponerlo en
being
modo
seen in the
presentación para
presentation
que
mode. Can you put
miremos
it as a presentation?
la pantalla en la que
Because we
exactamente.
see.
Ahí, ya, perfecto.
Okay, now
Ahora sí, perfecto.
Se haga, me muestra al revés. Perfecto, mil gracias por esa interrupción, Janet, porque es súper importante justamente
it is
que
very
acá
important and precisely that we have to take into account all these very clearly to be able to discuss and dialogue a little bit. And well, the message also that we were coming into at this moment is to be able to comply with those minimums, to be able to comply with those results of conservation. Well, the discussions that we have had at the global level now show us very clearly that we have different types of conservation based on that. Based on what? On figures that are in the case of the protected areas, legally acknowledged and have effective means. And not necessarily they have to be legal, but they have to be institutional. There has to be some sort of brand that will give us a protection, an effective protection, not only an acknowledgement, but also we have these other trends that is what we're going to be talking about today, about efforts that not necessarily have the conservation as their main objective, but that it ends up in an effective conservation in the long term. So there are several elements here that will, of course, clearly that is going to be talking about this, talking about the detail, but we have to take into account these two definitions and these different elements that we are pointing out here in colors, because the most important thing at the end is once again that we might find this, achieve this conservation in the long term, but to think, what do we want it for? So it's not only the effort of acknowledging it, of declaring the protected areas, but as we see it here, but to be able to reach those objectives that we're proposing through that effort of recognition, be it legal or institutional. And we are clear for what we want to do today. What for, and what is taken into account in that third goal, or that the goal of 30% of the Earth protected for the year 2030. And for that, what we have to take into account, and that is why we're having this dialogue, is to have a common language. We have to speak a common language. Although we're always going to have to, we're going to have the need of recognizing the particularity of the context of the countries, of the type of areas, and the type of governance that we have, of who is making the decisions in the different territories. It is supremely important, but it's also important to have a very task carried out as to what we're understanding for the different concepts of conservation. That's why we're putting it there. And once again, how are we achieving a conservation for quality? And it makes me think about a real life situation that takes place, and which when you're dads and those of you who are fathers at this moment, when you think that your parents have to have a better education in a large city, out of their countries, and universities of a great prestige, but they never ask themselves exactly if their son or daughter is made for that type of education, or is taking the right road for that. So it might be that the parent has made a great effort all throughout his life to be able to have an insurance that will allow his son to go into one of these institutions of very high quality, but that's not where things stop. But if I come to the university, I come into the institute or the country that I want to go to, but I can only achieve the registration, but I cannot go through the different tests that are given to me. I am not know if I'm achieving the success, but because they insured me that minimum coming to the registration, but it goes way beyond that. It's the same thing that happens also with the goals of conservation. It's not just declaring many, many protected areas. We know the famous concert of the coffee patches. And in that same sense, we have to learn to be able to apply principles and criteria that will make us, as we say,
Es
accept the
supremamente
other things.
importante
It is
que
supremely
en
important
consideración, además,
for in that consideration
específicamente en
to
términos de áreas protegidas
specifically
y
in terms of
otras medidas
protected areas
preventivas de conservación,
and other protective
con especial consideración de
uh,
territorios indígenas
measures
y
for
comunidades locales,
effective measures for
se
conservation
sí,
locally and
acercan
internationally, it might be
en el
effective.
sentido de
And to be
lograr
effective in the sense of being able to
garantizar
achieve that long-term
poderla
conservation,
demostrar, ¿no?
of being
De
able to
nuevo, no
demonstrate
podemos
it.
solo llegar al
Once again, it's
reconocimiento
not
y a
only
la
just to
declaración del área
come to the
protegida,
recognition or
sino
the
que
declaration of the
requiere
protected area, but we have to
herramientas
have
claras
some
para
tools, clear
poder en el
tools,
largo plazo
to be able to, in the
sostener
long term,
esos
be able to
resultados que
uphold
yo hoy en
that
día
result
estoy
that nowadays,
reconociendo
today, I am
como
recognizing
positivos en términos
as
de la
effective
conservación.
in terms
Entonces
of
no se trata
conservation. So
de un
it's not
porcentaje, ¿cierto? Es una
about a
motivación.
percentage.
Todos
It is
sabemos
a
que
motivation.
cuando
We
vamos a
know
cumplir
that
con
in the
los objetivos
framework of our public policies, it is important.
tengamos un mínimo
What is important?
porcentaje
We have
aquí
to know
como,
what is
como meta,
that we have to have a
como
minimum of
estándar.
percentage as a
Entonces, no
goal,
se trata del porcentaje
but it's not the
por el
percentage
porcentaje, ¿no? Entonces,
just per
eso
se.
tener también
That is something
muy en
that
cuenta.
is also
¿Listo? ¿Me puede
something
ayudar?
we have to take
Y
into account very well.
simplemente quería recordarles
And
un
I
mensaje
simply wanted to
que
remind you
traemos
of a message
de
that
nuestro esfuerzo por la
we have
elaboración
of
del
our effort
informe Planeta Protegido
for the elaboration of
2021
the planet the
2021.
report,
Y
a
es
Protect Planet report of
justamente
2021,
para
and basically
acelerar la expansión de los sistemas nacionales
to
de áreas
expand the
protegidas.
conservation of
Es
the
importante entonces poner
protected
todos estos
areas.
mecanismos de
It is
conservación
important to put
basados
all
en
these
áreas
mechanisms of
que
conservation based
respeten
in areas
adecuadamente esquemas
that
de
might
manejo
respect the
compostos y de tomas de
matter
decisión,
of
pero que también sean
conservancy, but
efectivamente
also for
gestionados,
them
¿cierto?
to be
Cuenten con
adequately
condiciones
managed,
propicias para el
to have the adequate
cumplimiento de
conditions
ellos.
to be
O
able
sea,
to
estamos
implement those
hablando
objectives
de los
that we are talking about.
presupuestos, de las
And
personas
we
que
are
están
talking about the
allí, de
budgets,
las
the people,
herramientas, de la
the
capacitación,
tools, of the
de
training,
luego poder tener,
of, as I
hacer un
say, to be able
monitoreo
to
de
make a
ellos
monitoring
suficientemente también
that is
robusto
sufficiently
para saber
robust,
que lo que estamos
to know that
logrando
what we're doing,
tiene una línea de
it
comparación, ¿no?
has
Un
a
camino para
line of
saber que
comparison,
lo estamos
to
logrando.
know that
Y
we are
que
achieving it,
finalmente estas
and that
áreas sean
effectively these
reconocidas como
areas
motores
have
de
to be
desarrollo
acknowledged as
local y que sean
local
sitios que nos
motors for
ayuden a reducir la
development and sites that will
vulnerabilidad
help
y
us
lograr una serie
reduce
de
the loss of
beneficios en
diversity and
nuestra
to
vida diaria.
have a
Entonces,
series of benefits
ese es
in
el
our day to
mensaje que
day.
quería
So that is the
dejarles
message that I wanted to
como abrebocas.
give you.
Clara nos va a hacer
Clara is
toda una
going to give
explicación de
us
efectivamente
a
de qué se
whole
tratan estas otras
explanation of what
medidas.
these other
Hemos
measures are
hablado
all about.
bastante
We have talked a lot
las
about
características de las áreas
the
protegidas a lo
characteristics of the
largo de
protected
nuestra vida.
areas
Es
throughout
importante que
the
hoy en
time,
día nos
but it
pongamos
is important for
mucho
us
más en
nowadays
sintonía,
to
entendamos las
get much
implicaciones,
more in tune to
entendamos
understand the interpretations,
lo que
to
implica
understand
también hacer
what
el
it implies,
reconocimiento
to make a
efectivamente en
recognition
la vida real de
in
estas
real
áreas
life
protegidas y para
of
que
these
estas
protected
áreas sean
areas and
cuidadas y para eso
for these
también vamos a tener todos
conserved
nuestros
areas,
testimonios
and for that we're going to have all
invitados
our
el día de hoy. Entonces,
testimonials
vamos a
for all our
continuar.
from all of our
Muchísimas
guests today.
gracias.
So with that, I leave you here and thank you very much. And if you have any questions or
Vamos a
comment,
tener un ratito más tarde,
we're
¿no?
going to have a little time for that a
Sí,
little later on. Yes,
esperamos
Clara?
tener un espacio para
Yes, we hope to have
preguntas.
some
Gracias,
time for questions
Paula,
and
por la
answers at the end. Thank you very
información.
much,
Creo que
Paula,
es
for the
importante el
presentation.
contexto
I think it is
que nos
important
permite tener una
to put us
visión
into the
sobre
context that
qué
allows us to
son
have a
las áreas
view of
protegidas, qué
what
son las
are the
áreas
protected areas,
conservadas,
what are the conserved areas,
cómo se
how
incluye en todo este tema de la
do we include in
conservación
all this matter of the
marcos
conservation, the matter, the framework of the
escenarios
effective
más
measures for the conservation
y también
based
tener algunas
on
reflexiones sobre los
this,
retos
and it also
que
allows us to have some reflections
desarrollar
regarding the
para
challenge
conservación.
challenges for this
Yo pues voy
uh,
a
process
darles
to reach the
un
conservation
contexto
areas. I'm
corto
going to
sobre
give you a very
este
short
tema
context
de la
regarding this matter
conservación.
of the
También
effective measures
contarles
for
un
conservation,
poco
to tell
sobre
you
lo que
also a
se
little
ha
bit
planteado
of what has
en el
been
tema de
proposed
la
to
región.
strengthen the topic in the
Luego
region.
para poder
And then we're
ver
going
un
to be
poco
able
más
to
como
have a
la
little more
evolución
clarity
de las
regarding the elements
de los
of
casos
the
de los que
COMEC
vamos a hablar
through the
en
cases that we're going
diferentes
to be
países
talking about
que nos
from
van
the
a
different
permitir
countries that are going to allow
ver
that is going to allow us to
cómo hemos
understand a little
venido
bit
trabajando este tema
how we have been working on this
a
topic
nivel de región.
at the region level.
Siguiente.
And the following slide, please.
Bueno, quería comentarles un
Well,
poco entonces sobre los
I wanted to tell you a
lineamientos
little bit about the
del
guidelines
COMEC y el rol que ha
of the
tenido
OMIC
la OICN, la Organización
and
Mundial de Áreas
the role that the
Protegidas.
IUCN has had in the Commission for
Como
Protected
ya
Areas.
pues mencionó
As it has
Paula,
been mentioned
es
by
un tema
Paula,
que se ha venido
this is a
trabajando
topic
desde
that we
hace
have been
muchos
working
años.
on for many
El
years
término
now.
de OMEC, como
But the
tal,
term of
fue
OMEC as such
creado
was
en la
mentioned for the
Meta
first time
15 del
in
2010.
the
Quiere decir
meeting
que
of
antes de esta
2010. It
mención
doesn't mean that
a
before that
meta
mention
no se
in this
había
goal April of 2011, it had not been worked on, this type of protection of our territories. It had been identified for conserving territories for a long time, that they are areas that are worked by different stakeholders and communities that allow us also to preserve the biodiversity. And based on this mention that is made by the CDB, the Convention for the Biodiversity of the Goal of 2011 in 2010, they put together a group, a task group, the Commission of Protected Areas for the International Conservation of Nature, IUCN, in the 2016, which allows us to generate a series of guidelines to be able to identify these different areas as protected from protected areas.
Global. Y pues más adelante
And forward,
la presentación.
we lost the presentation, Augusto.
Ya creo que está otra vez siendo proyectada. Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Entonces, pues,
So
que a partir de
we could
eso,
say
hubo
that
un grupo de
from
trabajo,
this
hubo una,
group of work,
discusión sobre los
it was a
para identificar
conversation
para tener ya
and
una revisión.
to identify the OMX and have a revision. There was discussed in different spaces with the expertise groups and technician and scientific from 2018. That it takes to us a decision of 14/8 and 2018, and is and define the criteria to the definition of the OMEC. And then this group of the OMEC, established as a specialist group, has more than 100 members worldwide. And there was a publication with a technical resume. And this moment, there is the process of a new version of the guidelines to present the report of the OMEC that is going to be updated very soon. It is important to remember that the decision 14/18 and 2018 that is constructed with all these guidelines from the Commission of the Protected Areas with the groups of specialists and different areas, but all the conversations with the different areas of conservation and biological areas of protection. And this decision invite the governments and governance that are related to in relationship with the indigenous groups to apply the assessment, theoretical assessment and technical assessment of these areas protected there. So this definition establishes the criteria and promotes the identification of the OMEC and also encourage the report of the OMEC for the Worldwide Center of Monitoring of the Conservation. So all these areas are zones that are delimited geographically, and they need to be in governance in a way that they can have positive results for the protection of the biodiversity. Components like services, ecosystemical systems, spiritual, social, and financial aspects of these societies. Like Paula was saying, these are the key points of the definition of how MEC became real and how this criteria has been evaluated in order to identify all the different OMECs. All the criteria that belong to this definition, they all have like sub criteria, but basically this says that all this area they need to have governance authorities that are legitimate, and in order to have more positive results for preservation, it can be presented and also sustained at a long term. The role that this specialized group on OMEC
Conservación equitativa y
is to
efectiva.
promote this governance in an equal way, and also to create and develop a more compromise in a very wider way for all the rights and for the parties that are interested, and also show the positive results of the preservation of all these areas, generating guidelines to be able to identify all these areas and to review that they fulfill the criteria and the different elements of this definition. Inside this group, one of the objectives is to increase the compromise with this group of human rights, all these areas of strategies that have different activities of governance. Also that the protected areas can have governance from the state, from the private companies, but also the governance areas that are all kind of relationships between different actors. Also, one of the objectives is to support the live systems and also to support that frame that helps to promote more preservation and also to recognize the efforts that it has been made from different factors for the preservation. And also to continue with those guidelines that can really measure those results, positive results, to the protection of biodiversity. So it's important to stand out with all these guidelines and tools comes from the specialist group, can demonstrate that the OMEC can preserve different ecosystems, habitats, corridors of the important species that have been threatened between protected areas. Saying, in other words, that we can keep those systems of protected areas with a very better variety. And this also can support to recover endangered species and also ecosystems, regulation of the water supplies, and also the threats from the climate change. It could be important to maintain the remnants of ecosystems that they're still functional for the connectivity and also contribute more representation, ecological representation and connectivity of different actors of all these conservation systems. From the Commission of the Protected Areas, this group of specialists has been generating a few assets. Here, a list of assets that have been published. The guideline for the recognition and report for these areas and protected areas. It is being translated to Spanish. Then we're going to have a reviewed option. So it has been a few years since it has been published.
Áreas, estas estrategias, existen varios materiales para la
Exist a few different materials for education for the introduction to the OMEC that you can consult in the page of the UICN. And you can see guidelines for application of the criteria. There is a special from the magazine Parts, and it was revised by OMEC, and they also talk about different cases, and also Protected Planet issued for 2020. This report that shows different components of the protected areas also included a chapter about the OMECs and to see in that moment how was the region advancing in that subject. So it's also different effective measurements based in areas that are, is a tool that has a version, has one version, then a second version is also translated to Spanish. And hopefully will be used for different places and countries that are in this process, and also products from different projects, specifically that has been called us in for these spaces. One course that is to include information, which this platform is called 30 by 30, that helps the fulfillment of these goals of the 30 by 30. It becomes a space to present different initiatives that has been made from different projects and different cases that has been also fulfilled. For the fulfillment of this goal, it can allows an exchange of experiences and reflections of the subject. So in the region, other the subject about identified in this Congress of the areas, protected areas in Lima 2019, in the declaration, the final declaration was established that the region has a lot of potential to identify and also give visibility to other effective measurements for conservation based on these areas. You can see in this graphic, the report was presented in 2020. That moment, a few countries already has been applied different criteria for the identification of OMEC. And now you will see that more and more countries have been following up on the same route. And this small ladder that it was proposed to follow these steps for the application of the criteria of MEC, the strengthening of this area, and also to present reports in these areas for different countries from different, and having these spaces of conversation helps for the strengthening of the different processes in different countries and allow us to reflect the challenges that we face. So talking about these challenges, we have seen from the work that is being realized or in these countries and different reflections and international spaces, also from the calling that continue asking us to support the different preservation from the OMEC. We can see to recognize the diversity of actors, objectives, motivations, and structures of governance. So we need to understand that the OMECs are not a category, they're a denomination that gathers different groups of strategies, and because of that, generates different challenges for the implementation. It's also important to adapt the tools to the national, regional, local context without losing the essence of the OMEC. We will see different cases of different countries that have been able to adapt those tools and those work frames to identify areas on their territories on the marine areas. It's also important to demonstrate that it does give us positive results in the conservation and biodiversity. Uh, and because of the different types of governance of these areas and different structures, we need to continue to demonstrate that we receive positive results and that they are fulfilling the great function on that system of the protected and protection of areas for preservation. Understand or comprehend what is the function of the OMEC as part of different wider systems and their difference with all the APs or protected areas. And to highlight the differences and see how they complement each other in different countries and different territories. Avoid the non-correct use of the time frame of the OMEC for the fulfillment of quantitative goals. We cannot only stay with the quantitative goals, but also with the qualitative goals. It is important to understand and respect the governance rules that already exist. We're going to talk about that with the legal framework, how the different processes need to be respected, how all these different territories have these legislation timeframes. And also it is a challenge that we hope to work further in the further months, the strengthening of capacity for the whole process, identification, strengthening and maintenance on the long term. In a few cases, it's not, we cannot see the evidence of the why, but we want to present the report People think that the report is like the final work, but Paula was saying this is a constant work and we cannot leave it behind or halfway through. Think that the mission has been overcome when you have the report in the worldwide database. So now to finish and continue with other cases, illustrative cases in this time frame, we are right now to want to consolidate a OMAC in Latin America and as articulation of the group and the goal 30 by 30. At this moment right now, this group is expected to have representatives of the OMEC of all the countries of Latin America as focal points. And we hope to communicate and promote more tools and guidelines produced by the CMAP or the UICN. Also generate spaces of exchange of experiences like this one, talking about challenges, lessons learned, necessities, identified and strengthened and the reports to the OMEC. And also we know that from 2010, this subject has been named in the goals. It has been a long way, a lot of conversations about the guidelines and the definition of these areas. And now we're going to advance and continue acquiring more challenges. So promote more spaces and identify programs and projects developed in the region to be included in the platform of the goal 30 by 30, and also to highlight the good practices of the implementation of this frame of work of the OMBEC in behalf of their region, countries, actors, and to learn more from those situations and have better processes. So here you have this invite to be part of the Worldwide Commission of Protected Areas. We hope that the ones that are not in yet, please continue being part of it and continue working with OMEC. Thank you very much. Now we're going to talk about with the different countries cases. We have 6 guests from different countries that are going to talk about the lessons learned and their reflections that they going to talk about. They're going to talk about specific cases they have identified in their countries, or they're in the process to identify of this process of preservation strategies. Lucia Ruiz, she's the director of the preserved areas of the WWF in the US and the UICN. She is joining us from Mexico. She's going to talk about the process of the identification of the OMEX in Mexico. Lucia, welcome. Thank you very much. Good morning from Mexico. Very fast, in 5 minutes, I want to present a case study as a potential OMEC in Mexico. And our country doesn't count or doesn't have a recognition more of the compromises that have been acquired for the biological diversity. Is still we lacking the strategy to establish how we're going to recognize the different omics. What we have advanced is to identify what are the spaces that could be potentially biomics. In 2020, we have the first mapping in Mexico to explore what will be these areas based on the measurements based on areas that could be contribute to 3 objectives: conservation, restoration, and sustainable use of the resources. These spaces that you see in different colors, also that are not exactly reflected here, that are very, very small, the archaeological areas, is defined that it could be instruments of planification that have an territorial expression, is spacious in our country, and contribute to 3 of these objectives. And justly, part of what we identified is that some of these polygons that have been identified here that it should be helping with subjects about conservation, but it cannot be named as a preservation areas, potentially can be identified as other effective measurements for presented divided by areas. So we're going to share it with you. It's a big effort, not only to share with you, but also and contribute to the 30 by 30, but also how it's related to the 70% that are we so interested in. The case study that I want to present today, I justly want to share, take you in a journey to the Mexican oceans that in Jacques Cousteau name it as the aquarium of the world, which is in Baja California, in Cortez, in the Mexican Pacific coast. Wonderful history that started in 2012, working with the different communities in a participational way and also being adjusted at their demands, generate and recognize zones of refugee and fishing and refugee areas. This is not managed by the environmental ministry. It is more related to the fishing and farmers ministry. So here we need to talk about these spaces that promote biomass, mostly when it's the fishing season. So in that moment, it was recognized and they credit those areas as fishing refugees. And that moment that we had was like fishing refugees, restricted. It means that you couldn't fish in there. No species could be fished as a commercial fishing terms. And they will have 5 years long term to be able to see the effectiveness of that instrument. And what is it that happened? A wonderful thing happened 5 years after, when they needed to evaluate if they were going to generate the reposition of the fishing refugee. And it was in 2017, what they were able to do is the area, it was degraded. These zones are the polygons you can see here. And it was almost 69 square kilometers.
And this is fundamental because it has allowed the fishing communities in Baja California are not only contributing to the conservation, but they're having better quality in the fisheries. So this is what we're seeing precisely in Mexico as a potential. And just to give you a little bit of numbers of the impact that this has for the preservation of livelihood, what we discovered after 5 years, after making some evaluations, is that 30% of the biomass had increased within the areas of fishery protection areas in comparison to other sites outside of them. And the fishery was where the fishery was maintained the same. The 60% of the species that are relevant for the fishery were recovered, and the population were growing. And the most important thing is the number at the bottom, the 84% of the fishermen were thinking that their species were in conservation. But the most important thing is that fishing was being increased. So from 2012, and having capture of 200 tons, it was going up to 6 years later to almost 400 tons. And so it was a marvel, because the truth is that what we're seeing is that through other types of instrument that not necessarily eyesight have as the main goal the conservation, they are achieving objectives of conservation. I would just like to make a specification here, because precisely when we talked with Clara, with Paula, they were telling us, look, when you're doing this, tell us why this might be a NOMEC. This might be an OMEC. The zone of a fishery shelter might be an OMEC as such because they might contribute to the conservation insight in the long term. And secondly, because they are not protected areas that have been decreed as such. And thirdly, because we are working hand in hand with the communities and they are contributing to an equal governance because they're having an effective management. Because precisely what we're achieving is that the communities are not only the ones that are there present, ensuring that nobody is coming in, but they are also monitoring the populations. They are having surveillance. They are having multi-annual commitments, but they are also working in teams with the government, local government, and with the federal government. And the most important thing is that they are maintaining the ecosystemic systems. In this case, the populations of fishing of commercial importance, but also their habitat. But the most important thing is that they are respecting the local values. They are working hand in hand with the community. So for us, this is a great example. We have a great road to walk ahead of us to travel in our country so that we can recognize the OMEX, but we are making some efforts and precisely through this identification and little by little identifying how we comply with different criteria of the OMEC is that we believe that we can make a narrative that is coherent and cohesive to be sure that not only the conservation, but also that the livelihood and systems that are being improved by the OMEC. And other opportunities that we have been observing very quickly, as I was saying, the archaeological sites. This is the archaeological site on the left at Quizimul in Quintana Roo in the southeast of Mexico, which is very close to a national biosphere reserve, but it is outside of the that protected area. And it is a continuum of the jungle that is impressive. And Quintana Roo, in the middle of the Mayas the jungle, that precisely might be acknowledged as an OMEC. And on the other hand, some of the measures that might be considered are units for the management of conservation of wildlife. Here we see one linked to a very important species in Mexico, which is a white-tailed deer, which is also distributed through other countries in Latin America. And these units of management for the conservation of wildlife are precisely for sustainable use of some of the species, but also ensuring that we maintain the in situ habitat so that we can also be sure that this uh, uh, use has some quotas or numbers. And I just wanted to show you an example of how, if we preserve the area of the white-tailed deer with the extraction of only some individuals, we can guarantee the maintenance of a population that is healthy, but at the same time, we can contribute to conservation objectives in the long term. So I would stop here because I know that we don't have much time. But I thank you, and any question you might have, I'm more than happy to try to answer. Thank you. Thank you very much, Lucia, for that presentation, for telling us a little bit about those OMEC that you have been identifying in Mexico and the process that you have had. Well, I believe that in view of time, what we can do is if the participants have any time, they can make them on the chat, and we'll possibly have a few minutes at the end to be able to answer a couple of questions at least. We're now going to give the floor to our next guest on behalf of coming from Colombia, Marcela Santamaria. She is a biologist who at this moment is a technical assistant director of the Reserve of Civil Society. Marcela, welcome.
Gracias, Clara, por el espacio y la
Thank you.
invitación.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you very much, Marcela. Well, with Marcela, we're going to make a dynamic that is somewhat different. We're going to have some questions that she is going to answer, and she's going to tell us also a little bit about the process that have been taking place in Colombia. And we're also going to have a presentation of a case, a particular case. Marcela, welcome to this, your space. And well, like many of those who have been activists in Colombia, Colombia has advanced in the process of identifying OMEX and also reporting. And we wanted to maybe ask you to present yourself and to tell us a little bit what are the lessons learned that you have had in the identification of these areas in Colombia, taking into account the different types of governance that we have. Go ahead, please.
Gracias, Clara. Pues como ya
Thank you,
mencionaste,
Clara. Well, as you mentioned it already,
hace 9 años como
I've been
coordinadora
working 9 years now
de
as a
la
technical coordinator in the reserve coordination of natural reserves of the civil society, and there, through a working group that we have conformed with the Natura Institute and the project of the CEPA and the IUCN, we have started working on this uh, of the OMEX and the application of the criteria. The lessons learned, well, there are many, especially as you are mentioning the topic of governance. We apply the criteria that go very much hand in hand, both a guide with a guide of the IUCN as well, the 1418, and we have developed through a project that was financed by the program of the UNDP. We have designed some questions that allow us to accompany and respond to those criteria, just as it has been established by the guide, where we clearly say that the criteria has to be applied case by case. So we have been working on that, and we have had some important approaches, and the criteria were applied by the people or some representatives of the cases that were selected in different types of governance. Important challenges, well, we see that, sorry, important lessons learned, topics related to governance. Well, we see that each case has its own specific configuration for the management, for the decision making, for the how it is being promoted and done. These contributions, both in the Conservation Institute of the biodiversity as well as of the ecosystemic systems. We see that, and we have been working on this, that we have been adjusting the questions more adequately to the context of the governance. And so that was a very important point that we have learned. The other very important is that we have seen that the application of the exercise of applying the criteria is above all an exercise of self-reflection for the people that are managing the areas directly, independent of the fact that the process might continue through a report. It is an exercise that allows us to identify those topics of strengthening, and we can see how this strengthening is supremely important for these initiatives. Configured all the way from the beginning for because of different motivations, but it has been a voluntary decision to leave zones and conservations within their areas. And I'm talking specifically about, and more particularly about areas or territories with a private governance and community governance. That would be very generally what I'm talking about, Clara. Thank you very much, Marcela. I wanted to ask you a little bit also then for those main goals that you have seen in the process of application of the criteria. That you maybe tell us a little bit more about the tool and how is the process of application, because it is important to apply the criteria case by case. That is something that is a key issue in the guidelines that are established from the all the way from the IUCN. It is very important to apply them and to see them case by case because, as we have seen it, we have said it, those criteria, those who are carrying out the process for conservation, are these representatives, the people that manage the areas. So, going through this methodology that we apply, that has been applied in Colombia, is from all the way from other entities and other instances, not only from the working group of this project that I had mentioned. It allows us to come to the field and to have them through a meta planning tool to be able to answer the questions, that it might be them who answer the questions and the people that are facilitating the workshop accompanying them. This is supremely important because, as we have seen, these are areas fact, and they have this configuration that through the application of the criteria allow us to identify topics for strengthening. And those topics for strengthening, we see that they are very important and fundamental to be able to continue on in the long term with all this process of and contributions in the long term, as it is being proposed by the framework. So that companionship is very important. It's one of the topics. Another topic that is fundamental that I have mentioned already is to identify the topics of strengthening, but it is required to allocate resources because since this is a voluntary decision in the case of the private governances, community and private governance, it is important to be able to continue on supporting these cases, that surely some of them are going to end up in the nomination of the report for the case of Colombia, but it is very important to accompany them in this process. And a final point, Clara, is that we have noticed that they require a lot of support in the matter of documenting and collecting information that demonstrates this. The information exists, but it has to be organized. And in many cases, there is information and there is this support that is precisely what accompanies the national route that we have designed to nominate that portal in those areas to the world database. But we always need to continue on working in these contributions so that it's not only perceptions or document data without documentation. Thank you very much, Marcela. So I invite you to present the case that you have for today. Sorry, it is very interesting that all these private initiatives and somehow they might start having some sort of a vigor. In many parts, we have what we call the separators, where that area of conservation, private area of conservation, is next to the RIT. And when you sell or when you inherit that property within the RIT, the area is demonstrated and it has to continue on being concentrated. This has not been something that we have not been able to do in Colombia, and it has been done in many parts, especially in Mexico and in the United States, they do it. And to involve within the property this area of conservation, and that this is to for life. Thank you, Guillermo, for that mention. As we mentioned, we're going to have a space for questions further on, but with you. Marcela, I think that you can begin with your presentation. Thank you.
Ahí estás viendo, Clara.
Are you seeing my screen, Clara? Yes, perfect. Thank you. Yes, you can tell us about your case. Thank you. The case that I bring to you very quickly, and not as detailed as the case of Mexico, but we will have space for more questions if you want. This is a conservation area that we have been working on since the year 2014 in Putumayo, in the municipality of Potosí. And this is a place that is called as Playa Rica. They decide to carry out the preservation of a humid tropical forest through an association that is called the Association of Artisan Fishermen and the producers of Playa Rica in Putumayo. And basically, they, in the case, through the project that I mentioned previously, they applied, as several of them applied, the criterias one by one, reflecting a series of needs for the strengthening and complying in general with those four criteria that have been presented for the framework. In that project that I mentioned for the program of small donations, we had a process for the strengthening that was very interesting. And as we mentioned it, for an area of approximately 496 hectares, it was to build a process for conservation that, or a system of conservation that was not dependent on the production of coca leaves in a zone where this activity is very common sometimes, and to bet on the process of security through sustainable fishery and the conservation of charismatic areas that might promote nature tourism. The area is managed approximately by 28 families. Among them, several of them are farmers and four indigenous. And when they talked about the application of the criteria, which were the ones that had to be strengthened, the ideas that were delivered were focused on three topics, as you can see there. To determine what were the areas of conservation and which were the areas of production. There was a whole care, as you can see, in the matter of the management of the beach, to carry out some process for the preservation of each one with the families that compose that route, and to generate a plan with the nature that is a process that they're carrying out to maintain the sustainability in time. They, in this case, reflected something very interesting. They followed all the routes, they applied the criteria, they went to the field to identify This was virtual, the topic of strengthening.
Y ya para el tema de la
They implemented it for the
nominación
matter of
fuimos a las
nomination
juntas
report.
nacionales,
According to the national
fuimos
board,
a campo y
we went to the field, and there was a consensus of all the people that live in that route. This is very important for the case of Colombia, and they are reporting, and I emphasize on the private governance and community governance. They are the ones who carry out the governance, and that is why it's so important to apply the criteria case by case. They established a roadmap, let's say, and because of a problem of limitations that is very common, that is very common in this country, especially in this northern zone. There was a overlapping with the natural reserve, private reserve, the Society of Protected Areas of Colombia. And this is, we are in working with those limits and to be able to see how we can fix this topic. It is very common in Colombia, and it is one of the things that we guarantee, Clara. But I take advantage of this case to tell you. They continue on working on their process. This is a territory that is duly registered in the world database, but they are also following the process of OMEC, and they hope to retake it to be able to work on that. I don't know if there's any questions, Clara, that I might be able to answer them.
Sí,
It's
yo
time is
creo
short.
que pues dejamos ahí. Muchas gracias, Marcela. Ha habido algunas preguntas
Thank you,
en el
Marcela. There have been questions in the chat that are directed to you. You can help us to respond those. Here it's important to highlight these processes require like punctual growth to be recognized as OMEC. Maybe they're not determined elements, but necessary elements for the identification and report. Continue with our next intervention. In behalf of Maria Lisa Arroyo, is the coordinator of the protected areas and communities in WWF Chile. We welcome you, Maria Lisa, to this space. You can present yourself, tell us a little bit about your work related to the subject. I'm going to do a couple of questions in the same way as with Marcela. Thank you, Clara and Augusta, organizers of this event. I'm the coordinator of protected areas and communities in WWF in Chile, with a strong point of view of the recognition of the OMEX, supporting the government of Chile mostly, and to emphasize the original communities. And I am a person that supports the process, the Chile government and the counterparts, the other parts as the original regions. How has been the process of the identification of OMEX in Chile? We know there is an emphasis onto the ocean lives. Through all this, how effective has been this process with the identification of the OMEX? Can you tell us about this process? In Chile, it does not exist identification of OMEX, but there is a process, a very big process and interest from the government and us as a nonprofit that it will be a participate and inclusive process to accomplish the results of that the OMEC needs. The government in Chile, with their protected committees areas, constitute the board of OMEX. And last year, we support the inauguration of this board. Harry Jonas as an organization, and what will be the all the contributions that can be set up to create this OMEC. And now this board is created, different government entities are already included in how this process is going to be. Something that the government of Chile has been doing is the definition of criteria for the recognition of OMEX. It hasn't been finished yet, maybe in the following months. And then a second phase of that process, the establishing of that government, is to establish 3 different pilot projects to see how those pilots can transform itself in different measurements of conservation. In the case of Chile, and mostly with the support of it has been more involved, is the transformation in a GEF, in the goal to get the 30 by 30 goal. And during the next few months, we're going to start the consultation. And one of the chapters that is very important of this national plan is how we do the recognition of OMEX. So there is a very interesting process from the interest to include the local communities and their original communities, indigenous communities, as a potential factors, especially in the ocean area. We have the Averlas, los Hempos, space host spaces from the original um, indigenous groups that hopefully will be recognized in the future. There's a lot of challenges that we're going to face. Also, on the other hand, tell you that also WWF is starting an initiative that is going to support the process of the recognition of OMEX, especially for the inclusion of the original indigenous groups. We want to design with these groups, how can we design and how we face the challenges to establish this OMEX in Chile or recognize the OMEX in Chile. Mostly these are initiatives that are related with production and productive resources. So this is project that has been designing and we want to implement with the government and the indigenous groups in 2027. We're right now just designing it. Thank you, Maria Lisa. I wanted to ask you, what are the main challenges that you have faced and relationship of those conversations? One of the most important things, it was in the presentation that Paula made, is that the subject that the communities understand this as an opportunity and not something that comes to uncategorize them, and it will create rejection from the indigenous groups, original groups. If we don't do effective communication, what the process is, these communities I'm not going to join. It's the same situation with the AMEC in Chile, mostly in the ocean areas, is that these areas are so potentially important and it has a relevance and that it needs governance and favorable conditions. And the AMEX and these areas, they're for productive use. That's the challenge for Chile, how we recognize this area and fulfill the objectives of preservation. These are one of the biggest challenges, and how we can do this synergy. Paula was talking about communication between locals and all the different state communities. So these are also multiple use of production, so that's a challenge. And also to contact the communities and make them feel part of it is a challenge. Analyze today and identify what is the benefit of for these communities to be added to the recognition of the OMEX. If we don't have it clear what is the benefits, maybe we can have a dialogue with them and convince them that this is opportunity, right, for them. Perfect, Maria Lisa. Thank you so much. And this subject that was continue working on these incentives for the communities and the importance to strengthen the systems that already exist of governance and to realize changes with this framework. I don't know if you have a case to present, or maybe this time you haven't really get to these type of subjects in Chile. Connection is bad, and I apologize. We dream and at some point as organization is surely with the initiatives that we have been supported, like the Fuwa and the interest to have as a use the plan of organization, the preservation to be recognized, could be recognized as a mix. But it depends about the work, how we can create the network with the different communities and this challenge. We don't define, like you were saying, the incentive mechanisms and strengthen the capacities for them to understand that the most important part is the preservation. It has been very difficult to obtain that dream. So here we have to have a good judgment how to create a network between the communities and the process to recognize the OMEX. In Chile, government is also supporting the process, the initiative to fulfill the goal of 30 by 30, and also in the addition to connect with original communities, indigenous communities. Thank you, Elisa, for your intervention. We're going to continue with the next one. Time-wise, we need to be careful. Our next guest, Patricio Hernandez. He's a lawyer and consultant in the international preservation of Ecuador. He's going to do a preservation. That is a very important situation. Is a regulatory framework of the OMEX and all this process of these areas that I believe that it could be very useful for a lot of the different countries that has been thinking to implement this type of framework. Patricio. Thank you, Clara. Thank you for the invitation. Good morning, everybody. I have this presentation ready. I don't know if someone is going to present it. I want to talk about the actual situation that Ecuador has with the framework and the process that it has been followed to the form for the formalization or regulatory work of the OMEX with the compromise of the country in the frame of the CVD and also a mechanism that talks about the objectives of preservation in Ecuador. Maybe start telling you that in the case of Ecuador, the legislation that promotes the a sustainable use of biological diversity has been the international instruments of preservation. They're still in line, actually, regional and nationally, but also you can see the Convention of Protection of Flora and Fauna through the different conventions and different plans of preservations that are still up to date. So this is the first point to highlight. We're very compromised from the international compromise point of view for the preservation. And then in the legislation, national legislation, it's very important the recognition that the Constitution of the Republic, that is from 2008, as a nature or Pachamama as a subject of rights. This is inside the Ecuadorian law, but also global side of view. It changed the time frame of only the protection of the legislation for protection, but also recognize the nature as a being, and therefore as a possibility to recognize rights as the same hierarchical level as humans, as persons. And also in the Constitution, it has a system to order the fragile ecosystems, biodiversity as a strategic sector. There is two important cases that are recognized as a regional, special administration regimes like Galapagos and Amazon region of the Equatorian side area. You can help me with the next. In line with the Constitution of the 2008 established, there is a important advance that the Organic Environmental Code of 2017 and regulations in 2019. What we can see here, what is the context, is that actually is on that right now from the legal frame help us to advance with these areas of preservation. In the code, you can recognize a few mechanisms of in situ conservation mechanisms, but also recognize other special areas for biodiversity conservation are like other areas, but this allowed that the national authority develop other forms of preservation. And from the special areas of biodiversity, establish the areas or sites recognized by international instruments ratified by the state, like the corridors and conservation easements. Exist a few in the country experiences and cases. There are two corridors of connectivity corridors that are already being recognized and initiatives that have been in the process to be established. There's a third way, the National Forest Patrimony, protected forest and vegetation. It can be compatible with the OMEC. It can be the forest and vegetation of the whole different parts of the country. Here you can see maybe the most highlighted is the different areas. They are related in a form of preservation in the country. Recognize that the half of the territory of the continental land territory covered by forest, or more of the half of it. And that percentage, the 20% of land territory, it is a protected area, areas preservation. And the fifth part of the terrestrial and marine territory under conservation of environmental management. And there are different forms like the existing water protection areas, the national level of care, maintenance, and conservation of water sources. They are very important for this resource. What is the actual status of the recognition of the OMEX in Ecuador? The participatory construction of the MAATE, ministerial agreement that regulates the voluntary procedure for identifying, recognizing, and reporting the ECMOs. And also with indigenous groups and to have a participational construction and consensuous. We hope the next following months, or maybe at the end of May or possibly in June, we have a concrete advance that a document has been validated and start up to there are three factors that have more repercussion, key topics, the feasibility of the extractive activities in OMEC, especially with the extraction of petrol. Another point it was important is the recognition of forms of conservation and sustainable use of ancestral people and communities, because their presence and their importance in the preservation is key. And then also has been mentioned in cases of Chile, always try to define the expectations, to define what are the benefits, incentives, and financing options. More than a case, I would like us to continue with the next. More than a case, I wanted to comment here that in Ecuador, besides the legislation, also exists a law or a bill that regulates the organic code of territorial organization, autonomy, and decentralization. Is the COTAD. And this allowed these governments to develop instruments of protection. And in this context, what this law protects, the competence of the GADs in land use and development planning and the land use and management. Exist a few cases that you denomination are areas of preservations, there are sustainable areas, conservation and sustainable use area ordinances. They're denominated as ACUS, ACUS. They have some restriction for some activities and some uses of the space, but they also contribute to the preservation. These areas are already created in some territories of the country, but also they're potentially in a good use for the OMEX. With this new law that is to come up soon, it will be one of the options or candidates for the recognition of OMEX in the country. Particularly, this is what I wanted to highlight. I'm open for any questions. Thank you so much. Thank you very much to share that experience of this time frame. Maybe will be a lot of questions. Participants can do questions. And maybe in other moments, we will have different spaces to have.
Atrasados en la agenda.
We are a little behind schedule, so I'm going to ask everybody to give us a few more minutes so that we might be able to listen to the last two cases that we have and to listen to the presentation regarding the report. And those people that cannot stay until the end, remember that the event is going to be recorded and it will be available to all the participants. Having said this, we give floor now to the next presenter, Damian Martinez, who is accompanying us from Costa Rica and who is the Director of Conservation and Policy in the National Fishery Industry Association and the protection of and the management of protected areas. Welcome, Damian. The floor is yours. Thank you, Clara. More than an example, we would like to thank you, first of all, for the invitation. This is a space that is very rich for the discussion. And I believe the contribution that we have for you today is some reflections regarding the topic of the OMEX and with the advancements that we have had in Costa Rica. With the colleagues that preceded me, it is very clear that there is a whole mixture of experiences here in Latin America of cuts, indigenous cuts, and this makes it very important for us to be able to have these options for recognition. Costa Rica is not the exception. Costa Rica has many efforts that have been carried out in the last few years. We have consolidated a system for the protected areas. The law of biodiversity opened the space for citizen participation, which has been consolidated throughout time, and this has allowed strategies for parallel strategies for conservation to those of protected areas to have been able to be consolidated. For example, the biological corridors, sustainable areas, the areas of fishery use, the topics related to tuna, indigenous territories. Nowadays, we have more than 270 private natural reserves for last year. The payment of environmental services, which is private enterprises through who, in which through the taxation of a fuel, they can pay for the services of conservation of biodiversity or forest. And just last year, we reported approximately 250,000 hectares in the country related to these initiatives. So it seems to me that there is a complete option and range throughout the whole of Latin America of examples that we might use for OMEC. It seems to me that the main challenge here is to see how we align all this work. How do we do, Maria Luisa was saying this recently, how do we do to communicate so that the people might be able to understand not to scare the organized groups, the owners of private farms, and not to have them think that this is something that has a double intention or a hidden intention. And not only with communities, but the organized groups, but also internally to the public institutions. This is not more work. It doesn't represent more work. It doesn't represent an overload of work. It's a recognition that is given to be able to reach the goal 3 of 2020, 2030. All these initiatives that we had in these countries, at least in Costa Rica, were never added to the goals of representativity. So we have to make that bridge. And that bridge will have to go through the how is it that we're going to measure this. Although it is true that in Costa Rica, after making some uh, evaluations, a lot with the guidance of the colleagues from Colombia, now we are developing standards that allow us to reach the standards as to which where we have to make the recognition of how it is that we are going to direct or how are we going to present all these different processes that might be included within ANOMEC. Because although it is true, and this is something that Marcela was mentioning, although it is true that the OMECs, many of them are de facto, we need to put them into order. And that's what we're trying to do from the country level. And we are building a regulation regarding that as to how we're going to carry out that process. For example, for the recognition, some indicators request the verification of improvements in the ecosystemic services, of improvements in the states of conservation of the biodiversity. So what we have to do is a blend. How are we going to do this? Are we going to do it with the same reporting? Are we going to do it with the same tools that are used for the protected areas? Or are we going to also have studies, scientific, alternative scientific studies that will allow us through the social aspects to work on this and also the environmental, what that allow us so that we can fill all the information of the indicators that come at the moment of thinking about the acknowledgement, the identification, especially the report. And so this reflection seems to be very important to me because these may be barriers. Different models of governance that we have in the OMEX, I might feel this like a shock because we might change the different dynamics of how it is that they're working, and that's the last thing that we want to do. And we, on the contrary, we want to bring them close. We want to give them a recognition, but we have to be very flexible, very plastic, very robust at the moment of identifying these benefits that are given to the biodiversity. With regard to the topic of financing, that today we have felt that some of the comments of the people that we give to protected areas is that today we might see the OMEX as a competition to the search of resources. And to reach the goals of 3030, there's going to be more funds coming. The OMEC and the consolidation of the OMEX may be an adjustment of accounts. So we have to be very clear on the topic of communication of all the advancements, of how this complements with the different situations of conservation that occur in our countries. And finally, to close, Clara, we have on the screen within the identification that we were leading with ProParques. This is an organization here in Costa Rica, project for the Ministry of the Environment. And we made an exercise of which those sites with a priority might be with a very simple algorithm identifying where the different models of governance were and the initiatives for conservation. We put where the algorithm identified them, where did they come together the most, those experiences, and based on that, of course, beyond protected areas, which is an area in the map, the green areas, we identified in red, almost in purple, which those sites might be. That might have a greater relevance at the moment of the protection for the OMEC to be able to give the country a determined area. And as you can see, many of these places are surrounding the polygons or the areas of protected areas, which would match very well with the ideas of conservation that take place in the country. Thank you very much for that, Clara. That's all on my side. Thank you, Damian. Thank you for presenting us the experiences from Costa Rica. I think that Costa Rica has been working a long time in the matters of conservation, and it is interesting to see how they are proposing this challenge of being able to incorporate the OMEX, acknowledging figures that already exist in the territories. And we are going to give way now to our next presenter, who is going to present to us the last case. She is accompanying us from Brazil today, Erika Santos de Guimarães. She is an assistant director Arete Socioambiental. She's also in charge of protected areas. Erika, we give you the warmest welcome. Erika is going to make her presentation in Portuguese. So I invite you to move to the channel with the interpretation that is more convenient to you. And I give you the warmest welcome, Erika. Thank you.
Clara, muito obrigada pelo convite, pela oportunidade de participar dessa discussão. Está sendo uma oportunidade incrível de aprendizado.
Les agradezco. I thank you for this appreciation. It's an incredible opportunity. And I ask your forgiveness for speaking in Portuguese. Since it is more fluent and the truth is to talk in Portuguese is better for me. So the expectation that I bring to you from Brazil are part of a course that were generated by another team that had a conservation in the name of great organizations that work in Brazil, like the OMC and other organizations of Brazil. We have made a very short study, which was to analyze the context of what are the OMECs, the international documents and experiences of other countries, like, for example, in Colombia, as Marcela said. We also made some public studies where we spoke with them in the Amazon public policy that we could listen to Mick, and we were analyzing a little bit, and we have carried out the webinars to be able to share experiences and to see how we can apply this in the Brazilian context. So this is part of what I'm going to present to you that have been created by this process in Brazil, like many other countries. This the proposal of the AMEC, it needs to advance a lot, and it is a context that is very overwhelming, but it opens the opportunity so that we might be able to advance in the discussion. And these were studies that were made by these 12 organizations to be able to advance in this agenda. In Brazil, we don't have any case of OMEC under the process of recognition, but in this study, we have seen some areas that have the potential of being acknowledged as OMEC. Within that area, we have the national territories, as many of your colleagues have already mentioned it, the private areas, for, some military areas that are used for training, but that could be considered to be under conservation. In Brazil, we have the army, land, sea, and air, and the areas might also be known as OMEC. There are community areas for the management that are important for those communities, and the coastal communities and another service, other places, and smaller scale, sustainable, other areas that are categorized as environmental priority in those areas. Public and private universities also have areas that have the potential of being areas of protection, protection of basins. There are many areas that could be taken into consideration as a OMEC. And the country might have many areas of protection, and there are still many other areas that have the potential beyond that to be acknowledged as OMECs. With regard to the proposals and the recommendations, we have two groups, one very conservative, very restrictive. Something that we might do in Brazil is to build national rules in regard to the 2030 goal, rules for administrative process, as we might establish some rules. And for this, it would be important for Brazil also to have a data bank to be able to include these areas. We have a data bank that includes more than 3,000 protected areas that we have here in Brazil, but it would be important also, or necessary for the government, to also have a data bank just for the OMECs. And to advance a little bit more in the conversation, it is fundamental also for Brazil to adopt those international criteria that have been established by other institutions, but everything that we do, that we're going to
Seria desejável
manufacture
que no
very
Brasil
clearly
pudesse adotar uma regulamentação nacional, como foi apresentado aqui pelo colega
would be
Michel,
favorable for
sobre
Brazil also to have a
algumas leis
documentation,
ambientais e uma regulamentação que
a
pudesse
national
funcionar
documentation, like for
desde a
example in Chile,
subnacional,
to see which are the legal frameworks, or to see even
acredito que
the
seria
subnational
interessante a
level.
par
And with
e a
this,
criação de um sistema
we
comum de
believe that we might be able to
fiscalização que
create
supõe apoio à implementação dessas
a
leis,
system that
fiscalização,
is
coordenação
interesting.
com
It would be a
órgãos de
system for
monitoramento,
a
enfim. Acho que uma
complementary system
coisa
of some of
para o
these
Brasil,
areas
especialmente pensando nas
for
comunidades
financing,
tradicionais
monitoring,
ribeirinhas, é um grande desafio
technical
no
support, and
meio.
financial,
E um
especially thinking
sistema
about
complementar poderia
the smaller
facilitar isso.
coastal communities,
Outro aspecto
a
importante
system
é reforçar
that is very
o
important to
caráter
create
voluntário
opportunities
do
for them.
OMEX, que é
Another
baseado
important
no
aspect
plano
is
de gestão dessas áreas, no plano
to
estratégico das áreas
reinforce,
protegidas,
to
que é
see
um
the
instrumento
voluntary character
comunitário.
of the OMEX, which is
Acho que
represents a
também
different
pensar
commitment
em
of
uma
those
lei
areas that are
nova
protected areas,
para
even though they're
agregar
complementary.
outros atores
And I think that the
importantes
OMEX
na agenda da
open up a
conservação.
very
Então,
important
isso para o
opportunity
Brasil seria
of
importante.
involving other
Um
stakeholders
país muito grande, mas muito
of the
desigual,
conservancy.
então a
And
base
this is
disso
something
vai
that is
ser
very important for
muitas
Brazil. We are a very
organizações.
large country,
Por fim,
and
Clara,
there are
em
many things that
relação aos
are still
desafios,
under that
onde você
goal of
trouxe a agenda
conservation.
dos países, eu acho que no
And
Brasil temos vários.
with regard to
Uma
those
delas
challenges that you
seria
also
a
bring
própria
from the other
definição de
countries,
qual
in
instituição,
Brazil we have several.
ministério,
One of them is
secretaria
the
ou
definition of
departamento, o
what
processo de
is the
regulamento
institution,
que
ministry, or
esse
secretariat or
participante
department
estaria vinculado.
or process
Naturalmente, a
for
gente sugere que seja uma pasta
the
ligada
government
à
to see
pasta
which
de
is the one that is going to
justiça
be
da
linked
natureza,
to support
mas
this
o nosso
project.
estudo ficou muito
And we also
claro que o
wish
OMEC é
there
um
would be
sistema de
something
caráter
that is
transversal.
related to the
Então,
conservation in
outros
nature, but
atores
it's
de
also very clear that the
produção,
OMEX
desenvolvimento de
have a character that is
fiscalização,
transversal. So other policies of
é
production
importante que a pasta que vai
are
ligar
somehow
o
also
Brasil também
connected.
seja capaz de fazer
So therefore, it
essa
is important
articulação
that
entre as
for
diversas
whoever
políticas
to direct the
públicas
OMEX, they
intersetoriais.
also has to do the
Temos
coordination
desafios
between the different
imediatos,
public
como
policies
A
and
Colômbia
intersectorial
me
policies.
apresentou,
We have
preocupação
challenges,
que é o
like for
reconhecimento
example,
da
also
intervenção,
in
a
Colombia,
certificação do reconhecimento fundiário da área. Então, esse é um
for
tema
the
sobre o qual o
recognition.
Brasil vai
The
trabalhar.
OMEX should not be a certification of a
A
specific
questão
area.
das
This is an
linhas
area that also
geográficas embora
Brazil
seja um critério de
has to
que
work on,
as áreas tenham
and the
linhas
matter
geográficas
related to the
definidas, algumas áreas
limitations,
com ecossistemas
the geographic
naturais,
limitations that are
teria que
determined.
discutir essa questão
Some of the areas with some
dos
ecosystem would
limites,
have
a
to
questão
be
da perpetuidade
something that
também,
is
né, o
discussed.
compromisso
What are the limits
a longo prazo,
with the
minimamente 30 anos de
perpetuity and the
reconhecimento.
commitment in the
E, por
long
fim,
term
uma última dimensão
so
que é
that
os
the MX might be
desdobramentos, que nós
acknowledged.
discutimos
And
bastante
finally,
também,
the
que é o
one
processo
last
de
dimension,
convergência. O
which is
Brasil ainda tem
the one that we talk a lot about,
mais
which is that Brazil still
desenvolvimento
has
dos aspectos das unidades de conservação, como chamamos,
advancement recently in the monitoring of the areas of
pensar que
conservancy,
acho que
as we said,
Damiano
the protected areas, and the OMEC is also
que
important
nós,
for to
nas
consider.
entrevistas que fizemos com
Damian
os
also
nossos
mentioned it, I think,
aliados,
that
ficou
cultural
muito
part,
evidente que eles
which is the
conseguem fazer um
challenge.
monitoramento que é empírico em
We
suas áreas.
normally have interviews
Então,
with
é importante
communities, and
pensar que o monitoramento que
they
considera importante para o MEC seja feito a partir do
do
reconhecimento
sort of
da
like an
efetividade
empiric
da ciência cidadã e de algumas
analysis of their
critérios da
communities, and that this might
LGPD,
be
e
through
isso é algo sobre o que a gente vai ter que se debruçar aqui no Brasil.
that
Com
the
isso,
OMEX
eu
might be
encerro a minha apresentação e fico à disposição
through
para perguntas.
talking with the different communities so that they don't feel that it is something apart. And with that, I finish my presentation, and I am willing to listen to any questions. Thank you, Clara. Okay, so these are some important points, and it makes us note a point that we had not talked about today, which is precisely the topic related to the monitoring of the strategies. That possibly is something that we're going to have to go deeper into a little further ahead. Well, and to wrap up, we're going to have our last intervention. Janet Lessman is going to talk to us a little bit about the report of the current situation of the OMEC reporting of the World Database. Janet is an official from the Program of Nature Conserved in the NEP, the WCMC, and also for the area of protected, the conservation of protected areas. And Janet, I give you the floor now for your presentation.
Y muchas gracias también por la invitación.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to share my screen.
Ok, ustedes van a pasar mi presentación.
There you see my presentation. Okay, perfect. Yes, we see your presentation.
Buenísimo. Sí.
Okay.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Como les comenté
Thank you very much. As Clara said, I'm going to talk to you very briefly about how the report of OMEC is in Latin America and the Caribbean to the database of World Database of OMEC. Here we have talked about the different processes that involve all the framework of the OMEC, the identification, support, and so forth. And one of the important things is reporting to the national database, but also to the international database, and also through this database, the World Database that is the one that I'm going to talk to you about. The World Database is contained in Protected Planet, which is a platform to be able to maintain data regarding protected areas of the world. It is managed by the UNEP and WCMC and the Commission for Protected Areas. And the information that they collect within that, we also have biannual reports of how the advancement is taking in place in matters of protected and conserved areas. And it gives us these global indicators to show us how we are progressing towards the third goal that was recently adopted in the framework of the World Summit. Next one, please. So in Protected Planet, there is a specific database for protected areas. There is a specific data for management effectiveness, and the one that we're talking about today, which is the one for OMEX, that for its acronym in English is known as WDO. And the next one, so this report of the World Database is very important because, as we said, the progress to the national goals as well as the international goals, according to Target 3, cannot be identified until the OMEX are identified, mapped according to, in accordance with the protected areas. Also, the reports of the OMEC to the World Database can help us visualize the efforts that are made for the preservation that are made from the OMEX and how they also help us add and contribute to the reaching of those global targets. Next one. Yeah, so for this reason, we created in 2019 the World Database of the MEC by request of the parts of the CDB. This database is updated monthly, and very briefly, basically the process that once the OMEC is identified at a national level, this can be reported to the World Database base, always with the consensus of the authority of governance of that OMEC. And although this database was created very recently, we can now see some 478 OMEX, 820 OMEX reported worldwide. These are the ones that are in orange in the map. We have been reported in 9 countries. We have Canada, Algeria, Guernsey, Morocco, the Philippines, South Africa, and Colombia. In the case of Colombia, it was the first country to report OMEX. To the date, they have approximately 55 OMEX reported. According to what we have in the database of Protected Planet, we see that the OMEX contribute considerably to the surface of the country under the conservation and protection, both at the land level as well as the marine. The OMEX that were reported have as an objective the primary and secondary conservation, and they are represented by the 4th type of governance. We have the governance on behalf of the government, by the private, by the indigenous, by the local communities, and also we have shared governance. Next one, please. Peru has been the last country in adding it to the report of the OMEX at the worldwide level and also in Latin America. A report that was done recently last year. We are talking about concessions for the preservation, and this report, this area, sorry, has a primary objective for conservation and a shared governance between the private and the state. And finally, to close, at the Latin American level in the Caribbean, well, as I was telling you, to this date, we have reported 2 countries. This doesn't mean that there are not potentials throughout the region. We have heard our colleagues how they have identified or how they have told us that in their country they have potentials for OMEX. What we are in this process, we are trying to understand a little bit of the framework. We are trying to see how we can implement it in each one of the countries, what is required for their identification, reporting, recognition. And in the case of Ecuador, for example, it seems that the Ministry of the Environment has as a goal this year to support the report of the first OMEX. So what I want to do with this is that we hope that we will continue on receiving reports from other countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. And finally, to tell you, and now that we are mentioning here, that obviously the contribution of the OMEX is not at the size of the coverage on the conservation, but also that they have that potential of contributing to the biodiversity conservation, to a more equal governance, and so forth. So these are some of the elements that are very important to monitor, along with those of the protected areas, to tell you that the information that we have in the database or in Protect Planet, Planet Protect, according to this information, is only a small percentage of the protected areas have been reported in Latin America and in the Caribbean. And also the MX have a management of effective management. This is a calling of attention in a sense that we also have to continue working and monitoring the activities of these protected areas of the MX and to understand what are the contributions for the protection of biodiversity. Thank you very much. Thank you, Janet. Thank you for the presentation. Well, we now get close into all the country cases with this topic of the report. As I mentioned in my presentation, well, the countries are in different levels in the identification and strengthening of these initiatives. Well, little by little, the topic of visualization through this report, as we have insisted throughout today's meeting, the report is not the final goal, but it is one of the very important steps to be able to visualize these initiatives. Unfortunately, because of time, we're not going to have any time left over for questions because we are way over time for what had been programmed for the meeting. And well, to respect everybody's agendas, I think that we're going to have to close this event today. And well, possibly further on, we will be able to have other spaces of discussion because I believe that each time we can have this type of reflections, more ideas coming out, appear that we have to go deeper into it. So I want to thank the panel members. I want to thank all the people that attended today and to remind you that this space was carried out thanks to the project of integral comprehension of 3030 in the Caribbean and Latin America for the preservation of protected areas and preserved areas. This is a project that is being carried out for the international cooperation with support of the REWITE, the IUCN, and the World Commission on Protected Areas. And as I mentioned, this project is going to have a series of final products that includes self-managed course of OMEX, and also a platform that will allow us to share experiences of 3030, 30 by 30. And to remind you that very shortly, we're going to talk a little bit more about this group, that we are going to start consolidating OMEC in Latin America, precisely to be able to continue on with these discussions that are so interesting. Well, without furthermore to say, I want to thank all the working team, and especially to Augusto Almeida, the focal point in Ecuador, for the CEMAP and for the topic of 30 by 30, that has made all the logistic management. To the interpreters also, I want to thank them. And once again, to all of you, for having listened to the interventions to the very end. And thanks to those who have answered some of the questions of the audience. Thank you for your attention, and we would be expecting a next meeting. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Gracias, Clara. Gracias a todos.
Thank you, Clara. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye. Good day to everybody. Have a good day.
August o Bernardo, ¿ustedes nos pueden aclarar dónde queda montada la grabación?
Yo descargo las 3 grabaciones en 3 computadoras y luego se las paso por WeTransfer. Y usted las debe descargar antes de 7 días o si no vence el enlace.
Ah, bueno, entonces yo creo que las subimos a la página de la comisión. Mil gracias, Bernardo.
Y el chat también les llega en ese WeTransfer.
Ah, bueno, excelente. Perfecto, gracias.
Mucho gusto. ¿Puedo cerrar la reunión?
Sí, puedes.
Es que creo que hay alguien que quería hablar. ¿La cierro?
Y pues sí, porque ya
Okay,
se dio cierre oficial. Mil gracias, Bernardo.
Voy a cerrar la reunión. Que estén muy bien. Muchas gracias.
Lo
por darme la
mismo,
oportunidad
cuídate,
de
gracias, chao.